The silence of the high desert was a living thing, a presence John Lone Tree had learned to read better than any book. It spoke in the rasp of the wind over sun-scorched rock and the dry rattle of a sidewinder through brittle sage. But this morning, the silence was wrong. It was a dead silence, heavy and unnatural, hanging over the northern pasture where his best cattle grazed. He'd felt it the moment he stepped off his cabin porch, the air still and thick with an unspoken dread. His sorrel mare, dusty and tireless, moved with an anxious energy that mirrored his own, her ears twitching at every shadow. He found the fence line just as the sun broke over the jagged spine of Saddle Ridge, spilling a weak coppery light across the land. The wire was cut, not frayed by weather or snapped by a panicked steer, but severed clean through with pliers. A deliberate act. John dismounted his hand, resting for a moment on the smooth stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. His eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, scanned the perimeter. He saw the tracks first, a single rider's shod horse, heavier on the left side. The rider had come in the deep of night, a ghost, leaving only faint impressions in the hard-packed dirt. And then he saw it. Lying 50 yards from the break in the fence, a magnificent longhorn, its hide, the color of rich cream, was sprawled in the dust. It was his prize bull, the anchor of his herd. John approached slowly, his boots making no sound. There was no sign of a struggle, no churned earth, no blood spatter that would suggest a wolf or cougar. The bull lay as if it had simply fallen asleep and never woken. But its eyes were wide open, fixed on the pale morning sky in a glassy, vacant stare. A line of dark foam crusted its muzzle. Kneeling beside the great beast, John ran a calloused hand over its flank. The hide was still warm. He traced the line of the bull's massive shoulder, his fingers searching until they found it. A small, almost imperceptible puncture wound, nestled just below the thick muscle of the neck. It was no bullet hole. Wedged deep in the flesh was the source, a sliver of dark chipped obsidian. He worked it free with the tip of his knife. It was an arrowhead, crudely made, but lethally sharp. The shaft was gone, snapped off, but the head was wrapped at its base with a peculiar dark-colored fiber, and it smelled faintly of bitter almonds. The moment his fingers closed around the stone, the world tilted. The scent, the shape, the cold, sharp edges, it was like a key turning a lock deep inside his mind. A memory, fragmented and fiery, erupted behind his eyes. A cabin burning against a black sky. The smell of smoke and something else. Something bitter and acrid. His mother's voice, a scream that was not a word but a raw tearing of the soul. A man's shadow, tall and indistinct, framed by the roaring flames, and a glint of light on something dark and sharp in the man's hand. John flinched back, gasping, the arrowhead clutched tight in his fist. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him kneeling in the dust, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a boy again. For just a second, helpless and terrified. He shook his head, forcing the ghosts back into the shadows where they belonged. This was not the past. This was now. This was a message. Someone had not just trespassed on his land. They had reached back into his deepest wound and twisted the knife. This wasn't about a single steer. This was a declaration of war. Cedar Bluff was a town that had settled into its prejudices like an old man into a worn-out chair. It sat hunched in the valley, a single dusty street lined with sun-bleached storefronts that baked under the relentless Wyoming sun. The cracked clay of the earth curled at the edges like burnt paper, and the air shimmered in a heat that promised no relief. To the townsfolk, John Lone Tree was a ghost who walked in daylight. He owned 200 head of cattle, a solid cabin, and the best fenced land north of the bluff, yet he remained an outsider. His silence was mistaken for menace, his heritage for a stain. His mother was Apache. His father, a white gambler who had vanished like a puff of smoke years ago, leaving behind nothing but a name and a handful of bitter memories. That name, his face, the copper tone of his skin, and these were facts the town could not forget or forgive. He rode into Cedar Bluff later that morning, and the arrowhead wrapped in a piece of leather and tucked safely in his saddlebag. He kept his eyes forward, his back straight, a posture his mother had taught him. "Never let them see you bend," she used to say, her voice as soft as deerhide, but as strong as riverstone. He passed the saloon where a few listless men watched him from the slanted porch, their eyes narrowed and suspicious. He offered a low morning more from habit than hope. The greeting was met with a wall of silence. At Jackson's Feed and Supply, he dismounted and tied his mare. The bell above the door jangled a cheerless welcome. The air inside was thick with the scent of burlap leather oil and stale tobacco. Mr. Jackson, a man whose face was a permanent roadmap of disapproval, nodded curtly from behind the counter. John gathered a sack of salt and a coil of wire, placing them on the worn wooden surface. As Jackson tallied the cost, the door opened again, and she walked in. Ruth Callahan. He knew her by sight, by the stubborn set of her jaw and the fire that smoldered in her green eyes. She was hauling an empty flour sack, her dress plain and patched at the elbows, her boots worn thin at the heel. Yet she moved with a defiant grace, as if daring the world to knock her down. He knew the Callahan name. Her father, Samuel, had been a fine carpenter before debt, and drink had whittled him down to a shadow. Now folks said Ruth held their small, failing farm together with little more than grit and desperation. She stopped short when she saw him, a flicker of something wariness, surprise crossing her face before she masked it. She gave him a stiff, formal nod and turned to Mr. Jackson. "Another 50-pound sack of flour, Mr. Jackson." "On my father's account." Jackson sighed a long, theatrical sound. "Ruth, your father's account is strained. Avery Talcott's man was in here yesterday asking about it." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Avery Talcott was a wealthy land baron from Laramie, a man who bought up debt and land with the cold efficiency of a winter frost. He was a vulture who circled failing ranches, patient and unseen. Ruth's chin lifted. "I'll settle it at the end of the month. I always do. Just telling you what I heard." Jackson grumbled, heaving the heavy sack onto the counter. John paid for his supplies in silence, his mind replaying the name. Talcott. He'd heard whispers of the man's methods, pressure threats, foreclosures that always seemed to benefit him. He watched Ruth struggle to lift the sack onto her shoulder, the effort showing in the tight line of her mouth. He stepped forward without thinking. "Need a hand with that?" he asked, his voice low. She turned on him, her eyes flashing like sharp green flint. "I can manage. It's a heavy load," he said, not moving. "I'm used to heavy loads," she retorted, her voice edged with a protective sharpness. She wrestled the sack into place, her small frame straining under the weight. She met his gaze for a long moment, a silent challenge passing between them. He saw the pride in her, but beneath it, he saw the exhaustion. It was a look he knew well. He gave a single slow nod, accepting her refusal, and stepped back. He touched the brim of his hat as he walked out, the jangling bell marking his departure. Outside, he loaded his supplies, his movements economical and precise. As he mounted his mare, he saw Ruth emerge from the store, staggering slightly under her burden. She walked down the street, head held high, refusing to look his way. But he saw the tremor in her arms, the slight waver in her step. She was strong, but even the strongest tree can be broken by a persistent wind. He watched until she turned the corner, the weight on her shoulders, a symbol of the invisible burden she carried every day. He turned his horse and rode out of town, and the image of her defiant struggle burned into his mind, sitting alongside the memory of a poison-tipped arrowhead. The two felt connected somehow, like the first and second drops of a coming storm. The storm broke 2 days later, not in the sky, but on the cracked earth of the Callahan farm. John was riding his southern fence line when he heard the sound of hard-galloping horses. He reined in his mare behind a cluster of junipers on a low ridge overlooking the Callahan place. 3 riders, strangers to him, descended on the small, weathered cabin like buzzards on a carcass. They were broad-shouldered men with the kind of casual cruelty in their posture that came from being paid to inflict misery. He watched as the leader, a thick-necked man with a face like a slab of raw meat, dismounted and stormed onto the porch where Samuel Callahan sat slumped in a chair, a bottle dangling from his hand. Ruth rushed out of the cabin, her face pale but resolute. The man's voice carried on the dry wind a low, oily drawl. "Callahan, Avery Talcott is tired of waiting. The harvest ain't in," Samuel slurred, trying to push himself up. "There is no harvest," the man sneered, kicking the chair out from under him. Samuel crashed to the porch boards with a pained grunt. "Stop it," Ruth cried, moving to stand between the man and her father. The man, who John now recognized as Talcott's notorious foreman, Jedediah Kane, simply laughed. He backhanded her a swift, brutal motion that sent her stumbling back against the cabin wall. John's hands tightened on his reins, his knuckles turning white. Every instinct screamed at him to ride down there, to let the cold fury coiling in his gut unspool. But his mother's wisdom held him back. A loud dog rarely bites, but a silent snake always does. A public fight would only make things worse for her. Kane loomed over the fallen Samuel. "You have 1 week. 1. Not for the money. Mr. Talcott wants the deed. He's made a generous offer. Sign it over and your debt is cleared. Refuse, and we'll be back to clear you out." "Understood." He punctuated the threat by grinding his boot into Samuel's hand, drawing a sharp cry of pain from the old man. Then, as quickly as they arrived, they were gone, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered dignity in their wake. John waited until they were a distant speck on the horizon before he urged his horse forward. He found Ruth kneeling beside her father, gently examining his crushed hand. Tears of rage and helplessness tracked clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. She looked up as he approached, her eyes blazing. "Did you just sit up there and watch?" "I did," John said calmly, dismounting. 3 of them armed. Riding down would have gotten us all shot, or worse. Her anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a weary despair. "They broke his fingers. He's a carpenter, or he was. It's all he had left." John knelt, his gaze taking in the scene, the broken porch rail, the splintered chair, the fear lingering in the air. "This isn't about the money, Ruth. Talcott wants the land." "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's barely enough to sustain us. It's worthless. No land is worthless to a man who wants it all." He set, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the same stubborn fire he'd seen in town, but now it was banked low, threatening to go out. Quietly, he made a decision. It was a risk, a deep and personal sacrifice. But watching her spirit break was a price he was unwilling to pay. He stood and extended a hand to help her up. She ignored it, getting to her feet on her own. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "The right thing," he said. "Doesn't always wait to be owed." He didn't explain further. He simply mounted his mare and rode away, leaving her standing in the ruins of her porch, a silent promise hanging between them. The next morning, John drove 10 of his best cattle, the strongest, healthiest longhorns he owned, on the long, dusty trail to the railhead at Laramie. He sold them to a buyer for the stockyards, taking cash, no questions asked. The price was fair, but it felt like he was selling off pieces of himself. Each animal represented months of hard work, of sleepless nights during calving season and long days under a punishing sun. When the transaction was done, he rode to the Laramie land office, a place he'd never set foot in before. He walked up to the clerk, a balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and placed a stack of bills on the counter. "I'd like to settle the account of Samuel Callahan of Cedar Bluff," he said. "The debt held by Mr. Avery Talcott." The clerk peered at him over his glasses. "And you are a friend," John said. He paid the full amount, plus the exorbitant interest leaving not a single cent outstanding. He took the receipt stamped "Paid in Full" and folded it into his pocket. He had no intention of giving it to Ruth. This was not a gift to be thanked for. It was a wall built between her and the wolves. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was not the end. A man like Talcott wasn't after money. He was after power. By paying the debt, John hadn't just helped Ruth. He had directly challenged a man who did not tolerate being challenged. He had painted a target on his own back. As he rode home, the land felt different, the silence no longer peaceful, but watchful waiting. He had stopped the bleeding for now, but he knew the real sickness was just beginning to spread. Avery Talcott received the news in his study, a room paneled in dark imported mahogany that smelled of old leather and expensive cigars. The room was an island of civilized luxury in the raw, untamed landscape of Wyoming. Talcott himself was a man of contrasts, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands soft and manicured. But his eyes were cold and flat, the eyes of a predator who enjoyed the hunt far more than the kill. Jedediah Kane stood before his desk, hat in hand, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "The debt's been paid, Mr. Talcott." Some fella walked into the Laramie office and settled the whole thing in cash. Talcott slowly placed his crystal glass of whiskey on the desk, the sound a sharp crack in the quiet room. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. His anger was a cold, precise thing. Some fella. Clerk said he wouldn't give a name. Just called himself a friend. Described him, though. Quiet type. Tall. Looked like a half-breed. A slow, chilling smile spread across Talcott's face. Lone Tree. He said the name, a soft hiss. John Lone Tree. He had been watching the half-Apache rancher for months. The man was an anomaly, industrious solitary, and possessor of the one piece of land that completed Talcott's valley holdings. More than that, he possessed a name that Talcott had sworn to wipe from the face of the earth. Sir Kane asked, confused. "I thought you just wanted the Callahan place. It's got the only year-round spring in that quarter." The Callahan place was the bait, Jedediah Talcott said, rising and walking to the window. He stared out at the vast expanse of land he now controlled. "Lone Tree took it. He stepped into my trap. He thinks he's a hero defending the weak. What he doesn't understand is that he just made himself the primary target." Talcott's voice dropped, taking on a venomous edge. "He wanted to buy her safety. Fine. Let's see how much his own is worth. I don't just want his land. I want to salt the earth he stands on. I want to erase him." He turned back to his foreman. "The rumors we started about him, amplify them. The cattle disease, the Apache curse. I want the town so afraid of him they cross the street when he approaches. And his herd. It's time for his run of bad luck to get much, much worse." The campaign began subtly. At first, it was just another dead steer found near the well this time. John examined the carcass, but found no wound, no arrowhead. Just the same vacant eyes, the same faint chemical smell on its breath. A week later, 3 more were dead. The cattle grew listless, their hides dull, their movements sluggish. They would drink from the well, and within a day they would be sick, stumbling as if drunk before collapsing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at John's composure. He moved the remaining herd to the far pasture where they drank from the river, but it was a logistical nightmare. He couldn't sustain them there for long. Meanwhile, in town, the whispers that Kane's men had planted took root and grew into a thicket of fear and superstition. Talcott's rumors were poison of a different kind, infecting the minds of the townsfolk. "It's that Lone Tree fellow Miller, the town's most prolific gossip," announced in the saloon. "Brought some kind of Indian sickness with him. The land was clean before he started working it. "My boy saw him down by the river last week," another added. "Said he was chanting at the moon. It ain't natural." The prejudice that had always simmered just beneath the surface of Cedar Bluff now boiled over. When Ruth went to town to sell the bread, she baked women who had once been her customers, turned away muttering excuses. Mrs. Mather, the preacher's wife, pulled her children close as Ruth passed her face a mask of pious horror. "That girl's throwing her future away on a man who ain't even her kind," she declared loudly enough for Ruth to hear. Ruth stopped, turned, and faced the woman, her voice clear and steady. "You're right, Mrs. Mather. He isn't like anyone I've ever met. That's the damn blessing of it." She walked away head high, but the words stung. She rode out to John's ranch that evening, finding him by the river, his face etched with worry. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that made the land look haunted. "They're blaming you, John," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They're saying you cursed the land." He didn't seem surprised. He tossed a stone into the slow-moving water, watching the ripples spread. "Fear needs a face to blame. Mine is the easiest one to choose." Their shared isolation forged a bond stronger than steel. They became a world of two against the encroaching darkness. Ruth began spending most of her days at his ranch, helping him nurse the sick animals, cleaning the troughs, and maintaining a silent, defiant vigil. She learned the rhythms of his work, the language of his quietude. She saw the deep intelligence in his eyes as he studied the sick cattle, the gentle way his hands moved as he tried to comfort a dying calf. Their investigation became a desperate search for an enemy they couldn't see. John, his tracking skills honed by a lifetime of reading the land, began to search for clues. He found faint, almost invisible tracks near the well, the same shod horse, heavy on the left. The rider was careful covering his trail, but he couldn't erase everything. One afternoon, while clearing weeds from around the well pump, John's fingers brushed against a strange plant he didn't recognize. It had small, waxy leaves and a single ugly-looking purple flower. His mother had taught him every herb and root that grew on this land, both healing and harmful. This was an intruder. He crushed a leaf between his fingers. A sharp, bitter almond scent filled the air, acrid and familiar. It was the same smell from the arrowhead, the same smell on the breath of his dying cattle. He straightened up, a cold dread washing over him. He walked to the edge of the well, peered into its dark, stone-lined depths, and understood. This was no disease. It wasn't a curse. His well had been poisoned. He ran his hand over the rough stones lining the well, his mind racing. He found it on the shadowed side, a place no one would normally look. A small, dark pouch made of uncured leather, tied to a loose stone just below the waterline. It was filled with the crushed leaves and roots of the bitter herb. The poison was seeping slowly, steadily into his water supply, a patient, relentless executioner. He pulled the pouch free. Inside, nestled amongst the crushed herbs, was a single hand-carved bead, identical to one he'd seen years ago, a bead from a necklace worn by the shadowy figure in his fragmented memory of the fire. The connection was undeniable, a jolt of lightning that illuminated the entire landscape of the past few weeks. The arrowhead, the dying cattle, the whispers in town. It was all part of a calculated, deeply personal attack. He was being hunted. He looked out across his land, and the land his mother had loved, and the land he had poured his blood and sweat into. It was being systematically destroyed from the inside out by a ghost from his past he couldn't yet name. He held the pouch in his hand, and the evidence of a hidden war. The fight was no longer about survival against misfortune. It was a hunt. And for the first time, John Lone Tree felt the cold, hard certainty of a man who knows he has to kill or be killed. With the discovery of the poison, the nature of the fight changed. John was no longer a rancher battling a mysterious illness. He was a man unraveling a conspiracy. He showed the pouch to Ruth, the bitter scent of the crushed herbs clinging to the leather. She stared at it, her face pale. "Poison," she whispered. "All this time, it was deliberate." He wanted it to look like a curse. John said, his voice grim. He wanted the town to do his work for him, to drive me out. Talcott, she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. He has a rider, John explained, showing her a sketch he'd made in the dirt of the distinctive horseshoe track. Shod horse heavier on the left. This rider is his ghost. He's the one who cut my fence, killed my bull, and poisoned my well. They were now prisoners on their own land. The well was unusable, forcing John to haul water in barrels from the river each day, an exhausting, back-breaking task. They worked in the shadows, constantly watching the ridge lines, knowing that every move was likely being observed. The trust between them became their only sanctuary. In the evenings, they would sit in the dim lamplight of the cabin, speaking in low voices, piecing together the puzzle of Talcott's motives. It still doesn't make sense, Ruth said one night, tracing patterns on the rough wooden table. Why go to all this trouble? Why the personal cruelty? There are easier ways to take a man's land. Because it's not just about the land, John replied, staring into the flickering flame of the lamp. That arrowhead, the bead, it's tied to my past. To the night my mother... He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. He had never spoken of that night to anyone. Ruth reached across the table and placed her hand over his. You don't have to. Yes, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. I do. He told her everything he could remember, the fire, the shouting, the shadow of a man, and the overwhelming feeling of loss that had shaped his entire life. As he spoke, he realized this fight with Talcott was not new. It was the continuation of a battle that had begun years ago. Their only hope was to find proof, something undeniable, that would expose Talcott's scheme. The town was a lost cause, for now steeped in fear and prejudice. The law was even worse. The town sheriff, a portly, lazy man named Miller, was known to be in Talcott's pocket. He enforced the law with a convenience that always seemed to favor the wealthy. But there was a new deputy in town, a young man named Evans. He was quiet and watchful, with clear, honest eyes that seemed to miss nothing. John had seen him in town, had noted the way he treated people with a quiet respect, regardless of their station. Evans was their only long shot. John decided to ride to the next county to speak with his cousin, Joseph Lone Tree. Joseph was older, a respected elder in their small Apache community, and he carried the deep knowledge of their ancestors. John showed him the arrowhead and the bitter herb. Joseph examined them carefully, his weathered face impassive. This is nightshade root, he said, his voice low and resonant. A coward's poison. It kills slowly, mimics sickness. Our people know of it, but have not used it in generations. It is considered dishonorable. He looked at the crudely made arrowhead. This is not Apache work. The fletching is wrong, the obsidian poorly chipped. It is made by someone who wants it to look like Apache work. The confirmation solidified John's resolve. This was a frame-up designed to use his own heritage against him. He returned with a renewed sense of purpose, but Talcott had already anticipated his next move. As John rode back onto his property, he saw them waiting for him. Sheriff Miller, Deputy Evans, and two of Talcott's men, including the brutish Jedediah Kane. John Lone Tree, Sheriff Miller boomed, puffing out his chest. You're under arrest. John reined in his horse, his hand hovering near his rifle. On what charge? Cattle rustling, Miller said with a smug grin. Kane stepped forward. We found 5 of your steer's brand, freshly altered, in a hidden canyon over on Talcott's property. Kane said, his voice oozing false sincerity. Looks like you were trying to hide them, sell them off before your disease took them all. It was a lie, a perfect, inescapable trap. John knew his brand was burned deep. Altering it would leave a hideous, obvious scar. But he also knew that in a town that already believed him, cursed his word, meant nothing against that of Avery Talcott's men. I rustled no cattle, John said, his voice dangerously quiet. That's for the judge in Laramie to decide. Miller sneered. Now are you coming peacefully? John looked past Miller at Deputy Evans. The young deputy's face was a mask of conflict. He looked from John to the sheriff, his hand resting on his sidearm, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. In that moment, John made a split-second decision. He could not be taken. In a cell in Laramie, he would be a sitting duck, powerless to protect Ruth or expose Talcott. He spurred his horse not at the men, but sideways toward the thick woods that bordered his property. A shot rang out, fired by Kane, whistling past John's ear. "He's running," Kane yelled. "He's guilty." John disappeared into the trees, the shouts of the posse fading behind him. He was now a fugitive on his own land. He was completely isolated, hunted by the law and by Talcott's hired guns. He had lost his home, his reputation, and his freedom. All he had left was the truth and a promise to the woman who was waiting for him alone and unprotected in the heart of the storm. The storm broke just after dusk, a furious biblical deluge that seemed intent on washing the world clean. Rain came down in solid gray sheets, turning the dry, cracked earth into a treacherous sea of mud. Wind howled through the canyons, tearing at the junipers and bending the pines. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening cannonade that shook the very foundations of the cabin, and lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating the ravaged landscape in stark, violent flashes. Inside the small cabin, Ruth Callahan barred the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was alone. After the posse had given up their chase for the night, Kane and 2 other men had returned, their faces grim in the fading light. Their orders were clear: if John Lone Tree wasn't found by morning, they were to burn the ranch to the ground. They were camped now in the relative shelter of the barn, drinking and waiting for the dawn, their presence a palpable threat. But John was not gone. He was part of the storm, a ghost moving through the wind and the rain. He had circled back using the cover of the tempest and his intimate knowledge of the terrain. He watched the men in the barn from the ridge above, his clothes soaked through his body, chilled to the bone, but his mind a sharp, cold point of focus. This was his land. They would not take it. He moved like a shadow descending the slick, muddy hillside. He gathered what he needed: a length of rope, his knife, and the heavy iron pry bar from his tool shed. He knew the barn as well as he knew his own hands, every loose board, every hidden gap, every weak point. The confrontation began not with a bang, but with a whisper. One of Talcott's men, sent out to check on the horses, stepped out of the barn and into the blinding rain. He never saw John. A swift, silent takedown, a gag, and the man was bound and unconscious in the mud behind the water trough. Inside the barn, Kane grew impatient. "Where is he?" he slurred, taking a long pull from a whiskey bottle. The other man shrugged, peering out into the maelstrom. Probably halfway to Mexico by now. Suddenly, the main barn doors, already straining against the wind, slammed shut with a thunderous boom. Before Kane could react, the heavy iron crossbar dropped into place from the outside, sealing them in. Panic flared in the second man's eyes. What was that? "It's just the wind, you idiot," Kane growled, but he drew his pistol, his bravado frayed. From the darkness of the hayloft above, John's voice echoed, quiet, but carrying over the roar of the storm. "You are trespassing, Kane." Kane and the other man spun around, firing blindly into the upper shadows. The gunshots were swallowed by a clap of thunder. Splinters rained down from the rafters, but John was already gone, moving through the labyrinth of beams and supports he knew so well. "Show yourself, Lone Tree." Kane bellowed, a tremor of fear now evident in his voice. "Fight like a man. You're the one who came to burn a man's home," with a woman inside. John's voice answered now, coming from a different corner of the loft. "That is not the work of men." The fight became a deadly game of cat and mouse in the flickering lantern light. John used the environment as a weapon. A cut rope sent a heavy block and tackles swinging down, scattering the men. He moved through the rafters, a silent predator, until only Kane was left cornered and terrified. As they faced each other, a new sound cut through the storm, the roar of approaching horses. It wasn't the posse. It was Avery Talcott himself, arriving with more men to watch the final act of his vengeance. He dismounted his expensive coat, already soaked, and strode toward the barn, his face alight with a manic glee. "Burn it!" Talcott screamed over the wind. "Burn it all!" His men tossed torches onto the barn's roof. The dried timbers, soaked in years of summer sun, caught instantly. Flames erupted, licking up the walls, fighting the rain, casting a hellish orange glow against the black, stormy sky. Inside, smoke and heat filled the space. John dropped from the loft landing silently behind Kane. But before he could strike, the main doors burst open, kicked in by Talcott. Talcott stood there, framed by fire and rain. His elegant clothes in disarray, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "John Lone Tree," he roared. "Son of Daniel Lone Tree, do you know who I am?" John faced him, the burning barn, hissing and groaning around them, embers falling like malevolent stars. "I know you're the man who poisoned my cattle and tried to steal my land." Talcott laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Your land. This land was built on the ashes of my family, your father Daniel. The charming, silver-tongued gambler ruined my father in a card game 20 years ago. Took everything, our savings, our ranch, our name. He didn't just win, he cheated. And when my father called him on it, he left him a broken, penniless man who put a pistol in his own mouth a month later." The revelation hit John like a physical blow. His father. A cheat, a man who drove another to ruin. "This isn't about cattle, you ignorant half-breed," Talcott snarled, stepping closer, his eyes burning with a mad fire. "This is about legacy. Your father took mine, so I am taking yours. I'm not just burning this barn. I'm salting the very earth your mother loved. I am erasing the name Lone Tree forever." As he spoke, a flaming beam crashed down from the ceiling, separating them. In that instant, Ruth, who had unbarred the cabin door and run into the storm, appeared at the side entrance of the barn, her face a mask of terror. "John." Talcott saw her. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "And here is the final piece. The woman who carries the future of your pathetic line." He lunged for her. John moved faster. He vaulted over the burning beam, a primal roar tearing from his throat. He tackled Talcott, sending them both crashing into the mud just outside the barn door. They wrestled in the slick, churning mud, their fight illuminated by the lightning and the raging fire. Talcott was wiry and strong, fueled by decades of hatred. He pulled a concealed derringer from his coat, but John was fighting for more than revenge. He was fighting for his home, for Ruth, for a future he had dared to believe in. He slammed Talcott's hand against a rock, sending the small pistol flying into the darkness. As they struggled, Talcott, gasping for breath, delivered his final venomous twist. "You think your father was just a gambler?" he sneered, spitting mud. "He was a coward. After he ruined us, he heard I was coming for him. So he ran. He didn't just abandon you and your mother. He sold this piece of land, my family's land, to your mother, for $1 to put it in her name, thinking I wouldn't touch an Apache woman. He used her to hide his stolen prize. Then he disappeared, leaving her to face the consequences he created. The words were meant to break him, to poison his soul. And for a moment they did. The image of his father wasn't just of an absent gambler, but of a coward who had used his mother as a shield. The rage in John was blinding. His hands found Talcott's throat, and he squeezed the madman's taunts, finally silenced by the primal need for vengeance. He could end it. Right here in the mud and the fire, he could erase the man who had destroyed his past and tried to steal his future. But then he saw Ruth's face illuminated by a flash of lightning. Her eyes weren't pleading with him to stop. They were filled with trust, with faith. She believed in the man. He was not the man Talcott was trying to make him become. His grip loosened. Vengeance was Talcott's poison, not his. Justice. That was his mother's way. At that moment, a figure on horseback appeared on the rise, silhouetted against the burning barn. It was Deputy Evans, his gun drawn. He wasn't alone. Behind him were two more riders. John's cousin Joseph and a grizzled U.S. Marshal Evans had ridden all night to fetch from Laramie. "It's over," Talcott Evans yelled, his voice cutting through the storm. "We found your man. He confessed to everything. The poisoning, the rustling frame-up. Everything." Defeated, Talcott slumped in the mud, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the hollow emptiness of a revenge left unfulfilled. John stood up, breathing heavily, the rain washing the mud and blood from his face. His barn collapsed in on itself, with a final deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The storm was ending, and in its wake, battered but not broken, he was still standing. In the storm's aftermath, where the world was quiet, draped in a gray pre-dawn light. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and wet ash. What was left of the barn smoldered, tendrils of smoke curling weakly toward a clearing sky. Avery Talcott and his remaining men, including a subdued Jedediah Kane, were in irons, watched over by the stoic U.S. Marshal. Deputy Evans approached John, his face streaked with grime, his expression one of profound respect. "I started looking into Talcott the day you were accused," he said, his voice low. "It never sat right. I found the man who shot his horses in Laramie. He confirmed one of them had a corrective shoe, made it ride heavy on the left. It was a small piece, but it was a start." He gestured toward Talcott. "When we cornered his man, the one you tied up, he broke fast. Told us the whole story. The poison, the arrowhead, all of it." John simply nodded, too exhausted for words. He looked over at Ruth, who was tending to a deep gash on his arm with a strip of cloth torn from her dress. She met his gaze, her green eyes reflecting the devastation around them, but also an unshakable strength. They had survived. As the sun rose, casting a pale, watery light on the scene, something remarkable happened. A wagon appeared on the road, rattling slowly toward the ranch. It was Mr. Jackson from the supply store. He didn't stop to talk. He just unloaded 2 sacks of grain and a new coil of wire, leaving them by the gate before turning his wagon around and heading back to town. Soon after, another wagon arrived, this one carrying Samuel Callahan. He was sober, his eyes clear for the first time in years. He carried his old toolbox, his splinted hand resting on the lid. He walked over to John and looked at the ruins of the barn, then back at his daughter. "A man needs a roof over his head," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I may be old, but I can still swing a hammer." It was the beginning of a procession. The Mexican vaqueros from the neighboring ranch arrived with lumber. Mrs. Ellison, the widow from the valley, came with a basket of bread and 3 chickens. Even Pastor Wilkins showed up, not with a Bible, but with a shovel in his hands, his face etched with shame and a newfound determination. The people of Cedar Bluff, who had been so quick to condemn, now came to atone. They came not with words of apology, those were too difficult and too late, but with the silent language of work. They came to rebuild what their fear had helped tear down. John and Ruth watched them, a tide of quiet helpers spreading across their land. The racial and social divides that had defined their lives were for a moment erased by the shared simple act of raising a new wall or clearing debris. A few days later, Deputy Evans returned from Laramie. He handed John a heavy leather satchel. "These are Talcott's personal effects. The marshal said you should have them. There might be something in here about your father." That night, by the light of a single lamp in their damaged but still standing cabin, John and Ruth went through the contents. They found ledgers detailing Talcott's ruthless acquisitions, and at the very bottom, a sealed yellowed envelope. It was a letter written 20 years ago, not by Talcott, but by John's father, Daniel Lone Tree. John's hands trembled as he read it aloud. The letter was addressed to Talcott's father. In it, Daniel admitted to the card game, but his account was starkly different. He hadn't cheated. He had won fair and square, but seeing the devastation it had caused, he was overcome with guilt. The letter was an apology and an offer. He was returning half the money and deeding the small northern ranch, the very land John now stood on, back to the Talcott family. He asked only for forgiveness. Tucked inside the envelope was a receipt from the Laramie Bank showing the transfer of funds. And scrawled on the bottom of the letter, in Avery Talcott's sharp, angry hand, were 2 words, "Never enough." Talcott had hidden the letter. He had denied his father the chance at redemption and had nurtured his hatred for 2 decades, twisting the truth to feed his all-consuming quest for revenge. John's father wasn't a coward or a simple cheat. He was a flawed man who had made a mistake and had tried in his own way to make it right. The next morning, John walked to the ridge overlooking his ranch. The valley below was alive with the sounds of hammers and saws. He held the last object his father had left behind, a tarnished silver locket containing a faded picture of his mother. For years it had been a symbol of abandonment and shame. Now it was something different. A symbol of a complex, tragic past he no longer had to carry. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the rich earth. He placed the locket inside and covered it, laying his father's sins and Avery Talcott's poisonous vendetta to rest. He was not his father's son in the way Talcott had believed. He was his mother's son, a man of the land defined not by the past, but by the future he would build. Ruth came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. Together, they looked out at the half-raised frame of a new barn, at the neighbors working shoulder to shoulder, at the smoke rising from their own chimney. The land was scarred, but healing. The community was fractured, but mending. Their love, forged in fire and silence, was the foundation of it all. They stood together, looking out at their land, a symbol of their resilience and shared future, a quiet testament to the idea that a home is not just a place you own, but a thing you build and rebuild together.